Right now, you're hearing music from my brand new Ableton Live pack called Dream Organ. Dream Organ is a collection of lush, dreamy, spacious sounds created from samples of the Yamaha PS20 organ synth. The Yamaha PS20 is very popular in the dream pop genre, and it was made famous by the band Beach House. It's featured on a lot of their music. It's got some really cool, warm sounds, kind of toyish at times. But when we put it into Ableton Live racks, when we put some effects on it, arpeggiators, and start manipulating the sounds, we get a lot of really interesting and diverse sounds that can be used in any style of music. I've created instrument racks that accurately recreate the sound of the Yamaha PS20, and I've also taken those sounds and combined it with the power of Ableton Live to create stuff impossible with the original hardware and useful in all kinds of music. So check out the Dream Organ Ableton Live pack. It's available at my store at brianfunk.com. And if you're a member of the Music Production Club, you will get this during the month of July 2022. And if it's not July 2022 anymore, don't worry. There's always something new and exciting for the Music Production Club. You can learn more about Dream Organ by going to brianfunk.com/dream-organ. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Music Production Podcast. Thank you for listening to the show about all things making music. On today's show, I'm with Nathan Ruyle, who is a sound designer and editor, a re-recording mixer. He's designed sound mixed for over 70 feature-length films, and just recently worked on a film called Joyland, which won the 2022 Jury Award at the Cannes Film Festival. And he is the founder of the post-production sound company, This Is Sound Design. Nathan, welcome to the show. Good to have you.
Hey, thanks for having me. Excited to chat.
Yeah, me too. For anyone that's listening, I just want to point out that you are sitting in a really beautiful state-of-the-art soundstage studio for film work. I can count at least, I think, 6 or 7 speakers in view right now, and I know there are many more than that.
Yeah, 28 surround speakers in this room. So
wow.
It's a theatrical Atmos stage. This is stage A at my facility in Burbank. This is Sound Designs. Is a post-production sound company founded by me a little over a decade ago, and this is kind of the latest iteration. We were in another facility until about 3 years ago, and this was sort of the dream, was to take all that experience and build out a facility from scratch. So we took a 4,000 square foot warehouse, and I just designed what I thought would be the perfect footprint for what we want to do. Also being conscious of, we have 4,000 square feet. We have we don't want to make a budget for it that's so big that we're going to have massive overhead, and it's going to mean that we can only do certain kinds of work. So we tried to find the sweet spot, and then also thinking about, where the movie business is, and things that are going to the theater and things that are going to streaming, and how do we create a process and a workflow that kind of accounts for all that. And so this is our big room here. It's a full theatrical Atmos stage, which we can talk about. We just actually, Dolby was in last week, and they tuned it up in Smart, and so it's a fully Dobly-Certified and commissioned theatrical stage, and one of the few that's probably owned and operated by a sound designer. So most of the theatrical stages are owned by bigger studios with more accountants and vice presidents, and so it's special to be able to have a setup like this, that we can sort of really dig deep creatively and on our own clock. And which is, something I dreamed about specifically when I first saw, it's been like 10 years ago now, right? Like the first Atmos demo, I was like, wow, yeah, that I can see that's going to be huge for us. And, and we're digging in, we're really thinking about how we can make Atmos a big part of all the work we do, not just the big budget stuff. So.
Yeah, and I mean, it's getting around now to the music side where we can do
Hmm.
that with our songs and our tracks and our albums. But with film, I think it's a very natural consideration because you have the visual on the screen and where things are. It obviously needs to work out that if the car is going left to right on the screen, you have to have the sound follow that.
Yeah.
So,
It's interesting, like maybe, I did my graduate work at Cal Arts up here and outside of LA, Walt Disney University. And I, before that, I was involved in theater. I kind of started out doing sound in theater and for live events and music stuff and recording music. And I came out here to transition into filmmaking. And I hadn't really, other than doing some interesting stuff with multiple speaker installations in theater and stuff like that, I had never really worked in film or worked with surround sound systems or 5.1. And, it's interesting, like, I remember when I first got my hands on on a console and a mix stage to really start to do a 5.1 mixing, and I was, I think, a little surprised at actually how limited 5.1 mixing really is, because you think of it as being like, oh yeah, there's all these speakers, and so you think of it in your mind like, oh yeah, I'll pan this around and behind, but in reality, a 5.1 system is the front speakers that are behind the screen, and then the side speakers, which are all basically the same sound. So every speaker is just playing the same thing at the same time. And then if it's a 7.1, you might have rear speakers, but most theaters are just 5.1. So, that sound from, like, it's not a fluid thing. It's a kind of, it's from here to here. So you end up, using surround sound a lot more in a diffuse way than you do in, maybe it's like science fiction or a plane going over, something that's very, very distinctly a movement. But in terms of kind of things that are a little bit in between kind of fully diffuse environmental sound and very dramatic pans, it's really not that sophisticated because you don't have the kind of spatial resolution that you think you might have seeing all those speakers in the theater. So, and I'm not complaining. I've gotten a chance to mix a lot of movies in 5.1, and I think I've, embraced 5.1, and I love spatiality is a big part of my work as a designer. Even before we were working in Atmos, it's something that I really take a lot of time and energy thinking about, and really creating space for each and every scene, and using convolution reverbs, using altiverb. So I was sort of developing some workflows way back, really ultimately even before the computers were really had enough horsepower to even do some of the things I wanted to do, which was like, oh yeah, I want a mono altiverb convolution. I want a 5.1 convolution. I want it for each stem. I want one for dialogue. I want one for effects. And, back when I first started, I was constantly running into the kind of limitations of the computer because, even if you had like an HDX card or DSP, altiverb, really after the TDM systems kind of went away, Altiverb's just a native plugin, and ultimately that's worked out well. Now we've got these super powerful native systems, but at the time, I was constantly just running into the RAM buffers, running into the processor limitations to be able to do really sophisticated work with reverb and really think about space in a detailed way. So, that was over 10 years ago. Today I'm here, I'm prepping for a big budget movie we're doing right now. We're pre-dubbing it and we'll go into final mixing in a few weeks. And I'm, sitting here like auditioning these Atmos 716 reverbs, which are like, even they do more than just the 712 bus that Pro Tools offers. There actually is additional busing so you can make 3 zones on the ceiling, so you can get these really detailed reverberations. And the movie we're doing has a lot of big halls and opera houses and big reverberant spaces, so we're really going to get to like lean into that in the movie. So it's been, I hadn't even thought about it till sitting here chatting with you, but in a way, I'm now just realizing with these tools kind of my vision for how I wanted to be thinking about sound in movies and thinking about space in my mixes a decade ago, and it just wasn't possible. And kind of just now we're landing in this place where we've got everything happening. We've got really powerful new Mac Pros that can really, they have a lot of horsepower. Pro Tools very recently really is able to kind of engage that horsepower in a way. We're getting really great stability. Avid kind of rewrote Pro Tools so that it can utilize the HDX cards for DSP in a way that's really smart and lets us be very thoughtful about how we're processing sound. And, and then now this theatrical Atmos system, which is, we just have the resolution 28 point sources in a space. And this isn't a huge stage. So, I was talking with the Dolby engineer. I said, this is on the small side of what Dolby will certify for a theatrical space. And I was saying, this is probably, one of the higher resolution Atmos stages, because the minimum speaker count at 34 speakers total, or 36 speakers total, that's they're in a stage 4 times this size, we would only have twice as many speakers. So it's a very high resolution. Our speaker pixel count is very high in this space, which is great for me as a designer because, I can really hear the detail of the panning and how we're placing things in the world. And then, when we're going to mix here for 3 weeks and we're going to go up to a big stage here in Hollywood to do 2 more weeks. So, we're going to have a lot of time to really dial in the mix, but kind of in a very, very focused on the kind of design and the kind of spatiality of it, because we can really hear it. Then when we go to the big stage, we've already kind of organized the world and how the mix is going to work spatially. So yeah, it's exciting.
Yeah, finally our technology, right, has just hit that point where I find it too myself. I'm really very rarely running into CPU issues anymore like we used to, and it's just throw another reverb on. Who cares, That's synth and it's all good.
Yeah,
I thought maybe if I could get you to maybe just describe the type of work you do, just for people that aren't familiar. I mean, this is a new world to me as well. So even just what it is you're actually doing, I've been caught, running around calling myself a sound designer, but I'm making synthesizer sounds, and I'm doing that for music and percussion sounds or whatever.
Right.
But I think it's a much different term in your world.
Yeah, I mean, it's also a kind of, sound design and sound designer. It's kind of it's a tricky subject. And I think we're all trying to kind of figure out how to talk about what we do and articulate it in a way that makes sense. Yeah, that crossover, there's a lot of crossover that creates confusion, right? That the world of sound designer in the music side, which is right, it's a synth, it's designing sounds and synthesizers, and which is very much sound design, definitely. And then in my world, it's, in the film world, it's also been a kind of term that's a little confused. It's something that I kind of zeroed in on as a person coming from theater. And in fact, that even the history of sound designer and the word sound design, it in the film business, it goes back to Walter Murch and Coppola, and it goes back to David Lynch, and it goes back to that kind of 60s era, Ben Burt. It goes back to this kind of era when, it's kind of the first wave of new American cinema, where the first kind of wave of technology was kicking in, right? And so it was really that first transition when coming out of where everybody was just in the studio and they were kind of a cog in the machine, and really, sound was really much more about recording than it was about creating sounds. It was about capturing sounds, synchronizing them to picture. That's essentially what you were doing. And then, in the 60s, synthesizers start to come around and tape starts to be more accessible. And so your ability to kind of manipulate sound became something that was more common. And the French, they had a whole wave of it in something called musique concrète, which collages of sound, and it was sort of in this kind of interesting space between music and art and film. And a lot of those designers in the 60s in America were inspired by, they were like, we want to get out of the studio way of thinking about this. Just I'm a technician recording. I want to be really digging in and manipulating and creating using reverb plates, using tape loops, and so out of that, at the same time, there was a tradition in theater of using the term sound designer. And my understanding of the story is that Coppola had been a director in theater before he got into film. And so he was familiar with this term of sound designer. And so when he started to work with Murch, he said, well, what you're doing is sound design. And so that was the first credit, I think, on, it might have been THX 1138, Lucas's first movie, or it might have been The Godfather. I can't remember off the top of my head now, but was one of the first times that you saw the term sound designer used in the credits of a movie. So it's interesting, and it kind of continues and pops up here and there. And certain people have kind of grabbed onto it as like, that's what I do. But at the same time, in the industry, we have these more utilitarian ways of talking about it, which is like, re-recording mixers, supervising sound editors. And, sometimes when people say, I'm a sound designer, others assume like, you mean you do sound effects editing essentially, or maybe you do kind of special sound effects editing when they can't figure out how to make the robot sound a certain way, so that's sound design. I personally I have a background in theater, and then I kind of went through Cal Arts, which is this very hybrid, it's where the Pixar people came from. It's where a lot of great visual artists and installation artists came from. It's where some really interesting musicians taught there, like Buchla. And, so there's this whole kind of soup of interesting, cool weirdness going on at Cal Arts. And Cal Arts has a sound design program that's kind of part theater. You can do music, you can do film. It's very open. That was kind of Disney's vision for what Cal Arts would be. You could kind of go there and do what you wanted to do. The whole system there is set up in a way that you can more or less on day one go talk to any teacher and get into any class in the institution. It doesn't matter what your major is. So, which is that's what drew me to that program. I was like, this is how I think about working. I love sound. I love movies. I love making music. I love recording. This sounds like the kind of place where I love technology. I love like the internet, which was now 15 years ago. There was a lot of interesting stuff happening with kind of interactive technology. So for me, when I landed there, I landed in the sound design program, and I kind of grabbed a hold of this idea and was collaborating with filmmakers and really gravitated towards film most of all there, along with some interesting installation work and some gallery stuff and some cool performance stuff. My friend Lars and I did a thesis project where we put an audience of 200 in headphones and then created a spatial panner where we could pan the actors' voices in the space so you got spatial continuity in real time. So we were doing some cool stuff in that kind of more avant-garde space. But ultimately, I really got into this idea of collaboration and collaboration in the film context specifically, and had some great successes right off the bat. Like had a movie that went to Sundance and won some awards, and had some shorts that had done really well. And so I kind of left Cal Arts and I came into the industry. And first of all, a couple people were like, well, sound design, that's not a job in the film industry. You have to choose if you're a mixer or an editor. That's what it's called here. And I was like, well, yeah, but to me, there's something else here. There's something that's more idea driven. There's something that's more about this collaborative, creative dialogue that I spent 3 years at Cal Arts having with these directors and musicians and other designers. So I kind of latched onto this idea of sound design. I was like, no, I'm a sound designer. And in both a kind of, practical way in that I'm exploring the potentials of technology. I'm exploring kind of what we can do within this context of movie making, but also in this kind of creative conversation that, is kind of something bigger than the kind of technical exercise of like, here's a director's vision for what they want with the sound and the editors, and I'm here to kind of technically execute that. So to me, I said, oh, well, sound designer is the best way that I can describe what that is. And that's actually when I landed. I'm like, oh, I'm gonna call my studio, and this is around the time I had worked on radio a little bit. I had done a few things. I had like explored the idea of like, oh, going into one of the big studios and working. And I was like, I've got enough work happening with some of my collaborators, enough things going on. I'm just going to build a small studio and try to do my own thing. And meanwhile, I was actually had a couple years out of school. I had started teaching at Cal Arts in the film program, teaching sound. So I had a little bit of income coming from there. And so I built my first studio, and I called it This Is Sound Design. And so the idea was, it's not about, it's that all of these parts of what we're doing, the Foley, the sound editing, the creating the sounds, the dialogue editing, the mixing, all of it is the sound design. It embodies, and I often equate this to the production designer on a movie, right? The production designer is the head of the visual part of the production. They help pick locations. They choose sets. They design sets. They choose fabrics. They choose furniture. They pick props out. They're the kind of person whose job overarching is, what does the movie look like? And for me, I was saying, hey, I think we need basically the same role, which is the sound designer, which is what does the movie sound like? And that's a big overarching umbrella set of ideas and a kind of creative conversation that's happening that then lands in all these parts of the process, just like the production designer with their team doing all the things to manifest what the movie looks like. So that's kind of my vision of what sound design is. Now within that, I'm also kind of straddling a couple roles that sometimes on big budget movies are done by 2 people or 3 people or 5 people. And a lot of times it's very separate between sound editors and the supervisor of that team and sound mixers or re-recording mixers, what we call them in A Vestige of Another Time, dealing with tape, re-recording mixer. That those are the people that mix the movie, and they're kind of separate jobs. And in the analog era, they really were very separate. The editor was cutting tape with razor blade and capturing sounds, and the mixer was dealing with dubbers and big consoles and EQs, and there wasn't much overlap between those skill sets. Now here we are, almost 100 years later, and we're all in Pro Tools. We're all using the same tools. We're all kind of in the same soup of work, and so I'm not the only one. There's quite a few of us now that we kind of do the whole process. So we're there at the beginning and doing and kind of having those first conversations creatively, supervising a team of people doing sound editorial work. And as the projects get bigger, the team gets bigger because it takes more people. The movie we're doing now is kind of a behemoth, and there's a team of, I think we have 8 people working on it in various capacities in editorial. And then we go into the mix, and on a smaller movie, I often just do the re-recording mixing on my own. On a bigger movie, I'll work with another mixer. On this movie that I've got coming up, I'm going to be mixing with John Ross, who's a great veteran mixer, and he's going to handle the music for the movie, which is this big orchestral score. I'm like, that's more than I need to be dealing with. I've got scenes with 100 extras and wild Atmos work to do, and so we're going to split the load. So, but overall, I think that I'm kind of a person who in the industry is advocating for maybe a little bit of a rethinking of how we have structured the process and how we think about the role of the people creating the sound in the movie. And I'm not the only one. There's a veteran sound editor and mixer, Wiley Stateman, who works with Tarantino and Oliver Stone, and incredible creative artist who has also been advocating for some of the ideas. It's always we're trying to figure out the language. Wiley says it should be called a sound director, which I think is an interesting way to think about it. I personally think the Directors Guild is never going to let that fly, but I think it's the same idea, which is that the person who's carrying the creative idea through the process and is equivalent to the editor, the composer, the production designer, the costumer, that kind of department head, as we sometimes call it, that, we need a term that honors that, as opposed to kind of the nitty-gritty technical part, which is like, oh, I'm the re-recording mixer, I'm supervising the sound editors. So that's, and I also think Wiley has this other great idea, which I sort of naturally came to with my team, and it was so interesting hearing someone articulate it who's much more senior, much more experienced to me. He's like, in my studio, we say ABM, always be mixing, which means that, this idea of like, oh yeah, these sound editors are just editing. They don't have to think about mixing. And then that goes to the stage and the mixers mix it. And we're in a time where we're literally all in Pro Tools. The idea of not shaping the sound as part of the editorial process doesn't really make sense. It's a more fluid process starting at the beginning through to the mix. So, by the time we get to the pre-dubs where we're kind of like cleaning dialogue and prepping for the final mix, we've already shaped the sound of the movie a lot. There's EQing going on. There's the editors are setting levels as they go. And so, even in that, this kind of the way of thinking in this divided way doesn't really make sense anymore, because the workflow for a lot of us is a lot different than that. So that's the kind of my roundabout explanation of why I consider myself a sound designer and what I believe sound design is. And I'm really hopeful that, as the industry is kind of embracing these shifts, that maybe we can move towards that. I'll tell you one other little aside. I did a studio movie here during the pandemic, and I won't say what it is or what studio, but one of the big studios. And it was a lower budget movie, but with a lot of sound design. There were robots and fight sequences, and it's with some people we've worked with in the past, and it was the pandemic, and we gave them a great deal. And I always say like, I even in my contract, it says I'd like to be credited the same as the production designer and the costume designer in terms of the credits. And most producers and directors are like, of course, that makes sense to me. So we finished the movie. They did these beautiful animated credits, and there was my card there at the end, which was cool. It's always great to see that. And then the producer called me a couple weeks after we finished and delivered. He said, "Yeah, the studio is going to cut your card out of the movie." And I said, "Well, what did they say? What was the reason they gave?" And he said, "Oh, they just said it's, quote, just not done." And so it's like, okay, that's interesting. And I think it's a little complicated, because I think there's a history element to it and a way of saying like, well, we've always kind of said re-recording mixer, and, we just think of this as a little more one step down from the other, creative side. Our union hasn't necessarily advocated for us in this way with the other department heads. But there's also the reality, which is a lot of the big studios own sound departments. And so they have a vested interest in, not seeing some of their talent internally be given this kind of recognition, because it would give us probably some mobility and some ability to negotiate higher rates for what we do. And it could be a way for other directors or producers to say, oh, I love this, I want to work with him. And, that's ultimately how I've built my entire independent studio, is that every single thing has been about my relationships with producers and directors, and people seeing the work that I've done. I've had movies that I did 10 years ago that people will seek me out based on that work because they want to work with me on a movie that they want to have a similar quality or aesthetic to the sound of that movie. So, it's a really interesting moment for us because I think this technology and the way that we're working is really exciting. And I think we're really stepping out of this kind of engineering mindset. Technology is so important to what we do, but the way we're using it is this really awesome, kind of very creative, very powerful, and sort of very important to filmmaking kind of thing. And I think the industry's still trying to catch up with the idea of what we do, So anyway, interesting kind of set of things around this seemingly simple term, sound designer or sound design. But
Well, some of the terms we have for the jobs in music have become a little problematic or difficult now. Even the term music producer used to really be somebody that
right,
is in charge of how the album sounds and the performances and what goes in. And it wasn't somebody programming the beat or writing the songs and recording it. Now so many people are doing all those jobs as one.
Right. Yeah, that's it. Yeah, I mean, I guess it's always the nature of technology that it's going, the technology changes the way we work, but the language doesn't fluidly move with the way that we work. So sometimes you have these kind of like points where you're like, okay, we really have to rethink this because it just doesn't apply anymore. Yeah, the producer thing, like, oh, there's 20 producers on this song,
Yeah, what does it even mean anymore? Yeah.
Right. Yeah, totally.
Yeah, and I find like the things you're doing, and you get me thinking about it a lot too in different ways. It's the kind of work that probably at its best is totally unnoticed by the viewer, where you want them to be immersed in the movie and be pulled into the world. And when you think of like the visuals, it's kind of clear. And it got me thinking back to a couple of years back when Game of Thrones had that episode where the water bottle was in the background there.
Yeah.
And everyone's like, da, da, it just ruins it breaks the spell.
Right.
But the same can be said for the sound. A few wrong choices. There's a reason why the sound of Game of Thrones isn't like Rush music or like Led Zeppelin.
Yeah. Oh yeah, and Paula Fairfield's dragon stuff is incredible. It's some of the great sound of all time, I think. And I also am a huge Game of Thrones fan. My wife and I now do watch it yearly, the whole series. But we're excited for the new House of the Dragon. So
yeah, we've gone through that dragons stuff a few times too, and it is just some of the most incredible film.
Yeah, amazing. But to your point, yeah, it's one of the ironies of what we do. I wrote an article for Movie Maker magazine last year, and it talks about the idea of sound being the invisible art, which by its nature you don't see it, and we as these like the neuroscience and the sort of our apparatus of perception is tuned in a way even to make us sort of consciously visually biased, whereas at the same time our ears are actually designed to do these really important things which are connected to our fight or flight and our emotions. And so it's like kind of this full range of like mammal experience, which is on one hand, it's like all the way over and like I'm listening for a tiger in the forest and my ears protect me, all the way to the other end, which is like this completely abstract set of feelings that are generated by sounds that we have virtually no control over, that certain cadences and certain tonalities like immediately create these feelings in us. It's like, it's so interesting. And yet we're sort of tuned in a way that we kind of believe what we see is what is real, and what we hear kind of floats down below perception. And that's, So that's the sort of irony of the best sound design should be unnoticed, because if the sound design is noticed in the experience of a movie, and and there are exceptions, but our common kind of modes of making narrative movies are all about kind of pulling someone into the experience so that they kind of become completely detached from their surroundings, and they're just sort of in the movie. There's this real, and we all know that feeling of like kind of this resonance that happens when you're just settle into a great film and you're just experiencing it through the character's eyes. And sound is such an important part of that. And they've even done studies where they put people in MRI machines and seen that if we just show them a moving image, it activates parts of the brain that are logical and processing in logical ways. And as soon as you add this synchronized sound to the image, it activates all these parts of the brain that make it an experience. That it actually, like, our brain doesn't even see it as different from our real life experience moving through the world. And that's the sort of magic of movies, is that there's this alchemy that happens between sound and image in our perception that tricks us like a magic trick into believing it's real. And that's that's cinema. That's when we say like this is cinematic, that's what we're really speaking to. And so the thing about that is that sound has this incredibly important role to be able to kind of make that possible. But if we do something in the sound design that kind of raises it up into the kind of conscious perception of the viewer, we then pull them out of this kind of magical envelope of experience that we're creating with the sound and the image. And so therefore you might be making a sound that makes you as a designer look really cool and be like, oh, wow, that's an amazing thing that was created. And this isn't in all cases. The dragon sounds in Game of Thrones are so incredible. You can't help but appreciate their design even while you're experiencing it. But even in that, a lot of times it's in retrospect. You think about, I think about the sound. And one of the things I often happens to me is like, I'm going in to watch a great film and I'm like, okay, I'm going to the Dolby Theater. I'm really going to pay attention to this sound design because, this person did it and I love their work. And within 2 minutes, I'm completely in the movie. I completely forget about thinking about the sound design or the craft of the sound design. And then at some point I'll be like, oh man, I totally forgot to even pay attention because it's doing what it's supposed to do, which is it's pulling me into this world and into this experience. So that's sort of the invisible art of sound design. And so, but I think one of the kind of great things about being at the point in my career where now I've done, I'm coming up on probably close to 100 feature films at this point, and probably close to 200 short films and other things that we've worked on. So I've kind of exercised a lot of my kind of need to be seen. Because I feel like I have been seen and I feel like people have appreciated my work over the years. And I feel like I've even carved out a certain niche in the industry of being a person you go to for a certain kinds of sensibility and a certain kind of work, certain kind of thoughtfulness to the work. And also now I'm working year after year with some of the same directors on project after project. So the feeling changes where I don't have to feel like I need to do something that's really the audience is going to notice. Mm. And so, when one of the things that's also a big part of that is that while I do act as supervising sound editor or supervising sound designer is what I often call it. And I oftentimes will have a supervising sound editor work with me to kind of do more day-to-day management of the editorial process so I can kind of live in the more creative conversation. And also to have a little bit of objectivity to the editorial process, because that's a real benefit to be able to be, if you're down in the material working on it every day and it's like, oh, I'm making the sound of this robot and you become so partial to it or so used to it even that you kind of don't have objectivity. And so then when you get to the final version of it, you've worked so hard at it, you can't be like, is this actually working? Is this actually living in the world in a way that it's really works for the experience of the movie? So actually, one of the things that I like doing is, as being the mixer of the movie, it also gives me a way to both allow some of the other creators that I work with to kind of do their thing, but then also for me to kind of objectively be like, okay, as the mixer of the movie, how does this live experientially, and how does this work experientially, and so that's also, that's an important part of my process that I've developed over time. So it's like being able to both influence the creative editorial design part of the process, but also to maintain some perspective is a really useful. And then, which ultimately then again, it's this idea of like sound design in a kind of larger sense, right? Which is that the sound design isn't also producing the thing, it's also figuring out how it works in the experience of the movie and also shaping it, and reverbs and space and all those things, musicality, where all the layers live together, all of those things in my mind are just as much a part of the sound design of the movie. So
Yeah, and we have the same kind of problems too when we're making music, songs, where you get excited about some like funny little synth line you made, and you lose the the forest for the trees, and now you can't hear the vocals.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
you
right,
miss like
right.
kind of the big picture, and it's so helpful to have a set of ears, to somebody to tell you that, because we do get too close to it. I'm sure in what you're doing, it's really easy to get lost in that, especially when you're coming up with these like new sounds and things.
Yeah, yeah. And also it's just all, movie making, and I have so much respect for songwriting and for the craft of producing music and creating music, because you guys have to sort of do it out of nowhere. It's like you don't have a kind of pre-built frame or context or visual or story that you're kind of working against.
I hear
And
this a
I'm
lot
just
from film people.
yeah. I mean, it's a really, I have an incredible amount of respect for that. And now, of course, on the film side, the writer and the director, they're often starting with a blank page too. And in certain ways, we are. If it's like, oh, here's a creature, or here's a robot, or here's some character in which the sound of it is everything that embodies it. And I've had some movies where I've gotten to do things like that. But I think in the music world, that's something that's kind of very magical, and I appreciate how difficult it is to do that. Whereas in like the movies, a lot of times what we're kind of doing is, we're trying to kind of exist in a space, and this is especially true in mixing, but it's true throughout, whereas we're trying to kind of channel this experience of the audience. And so you have to kind of develop this feeling, and I'm sure there's some of this in music, especially music mixing too, but like where you have to develop this ability to both go in and adjust or EQ or add a layer, and then or adjust the proportion between different layers in an ambient sound, and sort of in this kind of very kind of technical and pragmatic kind of way of like, okay, I know how this should function, I know where it's in the space, I know what the levels are, and then to pull back and be like, okay, now I'm gonna like put that away and try to get myself into a space where I'm experiencing this like I've never seen it before, which is like, honestly, most film audiences watch something one time, right? Like, hopefully I do a classic film, and once in a while I work on something. We had close friends, and we did this movie, The Voyeurs, with Amazon last year, and one of our close friends said, "Oh, we've watched it 4 times. We love it so much." That's a very rare thing, to able to watch movies over and over and over. TV, maybe a Game of Thrones, maybe, but most of the time it's one time. So, you're really creating material that someone's going to literally experience in real time one time and never ever experience it again. So whereas if I'm sitting there grinding on a moment in a film over and over and over, you get very desensitized to the experience of it. And sometimes it's like very dramatic. It's like, even, in like a practical technical sense, it's like, oh, I'm working on a dialogue section and I'm like, oh, I'm cleaning it, EQing it, doing all this stuff. Like, I think I have it one way. I literally go away for 2 minutes and come back, and it sounds completely different than what I was hearing, because our brains are so powerful in shaping even how we're hearing it. And so that's, it becomes a really critical part of the work, is like, how do I kind of disengage from the kind of the engineer and the kind of technical part of accomplishing this, and also just the like true fatigue of seeing it over and over again, and get to the kind of pure, raw way most people experience, which is one time passing like it's real life and never to be seen again. So it's something I think a lot about. And it's something I actually encourage directors to think a lot about, because they often come in and they've been working on a section of the movie for months, and they have these certain sounds that are in there, and they've really heard them literally 1,000 times, and they're like, they can't experience the thing pure again, And so sometimes it's almost like, we try to, one of the reasons we try to make these spaces kind of zen and very comfortable and very kind of like, there's a certain feeling, and that actually has a practical element to it, which is that it gets everybody kind of in a little bit more of a kind of open space, because sometimes we have to like deprogram the director a little bit over the course of the week of a movie for a few scenes. And, it's most of the time people kind of get into that, especially if we talk about it a little bit, and just to be like, we got to like kind of loosen up here. We got to shake it out, because we've been holding really tight onto this certain thing. And it's not just for director. I do the same thing. And so that's a big part of the process. So,
yeah, you can't be holding out for those little details that they're going to love this the 5th time they see it.
yeah, exactly. So, yeah.
I laugh when you mentioned about the sound design and, being forgetful, or not forgetful, but being like almost unnoticed and forgotten.
Yeah.
And I went to see one of those early movies that Trent Reznor and Atticus Ross did the music and sound for.
Oh,
and,
amazing.
I was at like the end of the movie, and the whole reason I went there, it might have been like The Social Network or whatever it was.
Yeah.
I went there because I wanted to hear the music.
Right.
I specifically went to the theater because I wanted, and it was like the last 10 minutes of the movie, I was like, oh no, I didn't pay any attention to it at all.
Right. The nice thing about music in movies is most of the time there's a soundtrack, especially like a movie like that. So you really can kind of decontextualize it and really appreciate it for what it is. There's very few movies where you have that for the sound. However, there are a few, and one of my all-time favorite movies is the movie Gravity. And Gravity, it's a space film with Sandra Bullock, and it's actually one of the first Atmos mixes. Skip Levisay did it, New York, one of the all-time great sound mixers. And because it's space, there's all these there's this incredible montage of radio signals, and it's spread out around the room, so you really can hear all of it. Even the 5/1 mix of that doesn't do it justice. And then, there's a moment where George Clooney is floating. He floats out of frame, and then you hear him still talking as he's passing around. And it's that Atmos mix, so it's very fluid. And then there's another moment where the camera, Sandra Bullock, it goes and it passes through her helmet of her spacesuit, and then turns, and you hear the whole room turn. It's just the most brilliant, incredible. It was one of the first Atmos mixes. It's just a testament to what a genius Skip is. And he worked with the Coens and one of the greats, but that movie is just, it's so incredible. And the Blu-ray version of that, which does have a 712 Atmos mix on it, you can watch. Not as good as a theatrical, which we could talk a little bit about. I'm kind of in that space right now. But they do have a version of the movie on the Blu-ray called the No Sound in Space version. And so they take away the score. So it's just the sound design without the score for the whole movie. And it's really, really cool. Because there's some scenes in that movie where like there's a meteor shower and like the whole world just explodes. And the music is brilliant and huge and kind of the driver of that scene, but then when you hear it without that, you hear all the sort of gnarly design that was going on for all those impacts and things. Is really, really cool. So that is one people should check out. That's I recently, we could talk a little bit about kind of more of the Atmos stuff I'm doing, but I recently, because I'm getting ready to do this theatrical Atmos mix, and we've had an Atmos. We have a home theater Atmos stage. So this footprint, and people can check it out on our website, which is TISD. This is sound design, TISD.TV. And on the website, you can go and there's actually a little 3D tour of the facility. You can go and look around. It's like when I made the blueprints for the studio when I was kind of designing it. And so we actually were able to find a plugin. We could just put that right on the website. You can go in and look around and look at the different stages. We haven't updated it for the theatrical Atmos room yet. The stage still shows 7.1, but so we have stage B on the other side of the machine room. Here is it's a 914 Atmos room, so a home theater style Atmos room. And then we're building a third little near field 712, just like straight what you would get with like a home theater without even any extra speakers. So I've been working with Atmos, and I've done a couple remixes for Atmos for NBC Universal on a couple movies we did. We did a movie called Profile that Focus Features put out last year. That's pretty cool, and we did an immersive mix on that. But I actually recently, so I was working on this big movie, and we're getting ready with Atmos. I'm like, well, I got to get some Atmos for my house. And my father-in-law had bought the Sonos Arc, which is the Atmos soundbar, and he was raving about it. So I was like, okay, I went ahead and ordered it. And the first thing I did, and I don't know if you know, but it's just truly just a sound bar, but it has multiple speakers. So basically there's speakers on the side, and you actually have an app on the phone. You can tune the bar for your room, and it actually bounces sound off the sidewalls, and then it has speakers that fire up and bounce off the ceiling. So you get a true like LCR front, and you get a true kind of immersive experience. But I was like, okay, listen, I've got an Atmos stage here. I've heard a lot of Atmos mixes. I always try to see Atmos movies in the theater at the Dolby Theater here in Burbank, or they just opened a new one out in Topanga where I own a home. And I love the Atmos theatrical experience. And I've been kind of like enjoyed the immersive experience of home theater, but I've been kind of lukewarm on it. But I will say that the Sonos Arc is truly a kind of brilliant device, and it for real does an Atmos experience. And I was like, all right, I'm going to test it. My wife was there, and my wife's like, she's a music person, but she's also kind of she's like, I don't like a lot of complicated stuff at home. I don't need a bunch of noise all the time. So I was like, all right, well, let's test it out. And so we downloaded on Apple TV the Gravity Mix. And I was like, this will be the test. If these scenes work in here, and we went and sat down and we played through those scenes, and my wife was like, oh my God, I can't believe it. Literally, all those scenes and George Clooney's voice floating behind, all from the soundbar. Remarkable, absolutely remarkable. So I'm actually, so that's exciting, because I feel like, one of the things about Atmos is that, like, we're going to do this incredible theatrical mix for this big movie, but like, how many people are going to get to experience that mix? But actually, now that these home devices are really kind of finding a way to kind of reproduce that, I kind of feel, like actually there's going to be, a chance to really experience at least a version of what we're doing for the movie theater. And I think I've listened to a few of the Atmos mixed music tracks on the bar, and I'm also like, this sounds really great. I will say I did initially not buy the subwoofer for it. And then I bought the subwoofer, and it actually makes a big difference, because that is the thing that the biggest speaker on that bar is probably this big, and I could hear it. My wife was like, "I don't want a subwoofer in the house." I was like, "Listen," I can hear these speakers struggling, and I can't deal with that. So, but we got the sub. The sub is actually, it's only about this big. It's one of these kind of like, Bose style. It's using like a tunnel, and it has great low end, and it's very compact and very cool looking. So it's not like a big woofer you're sitting in the living room. So all in all, I have to say a rave review for the Arc. So if people are like interested in this kind of movie space for Atmos, I do recommend it. It's it's an investment. It's not cheap, but it does perform as advertised. So.
That's pretty cool. And it's nice that the theater isn't the only place. The special theaters, especially, aren't the only place for you to experience this on some level, anyway.
Yeah.
Maybe I can ask you to kind of tell me a bit about this space you have here, and what that means for you as far as mixing, and also I'm kind of wondering too, since you're surrounded by sound now in ways like never before, is there kind of like a limitation on the screen itself now with the visuals, because you're only getting like, it's like
right.
We need a 360 type camera going on.
Yeah. Well, I think that's an interesting point, and I think I think we definitely, like, we have 4K pictures, so we definitely have great quality, and I think that there is still a lot of, I think, having worked in VR, so I have a little better perspective on kind of 360 experiences. The VR experience opens up a lot of other pitfalls, and there's a lot going on in that, like, kind of visually immersive world, that it's like it can be cinematic, but I really kind of leans more towards a gaming experience. And it's hard. There's a certain kind of compression in the experience of the image in the frame, and then using the sound to kind of, you're kind of pulling the audience into the world of the frame, as opposed to kind of trying to meet the audience in this kind of visual space. And what I find as a sound designer is that having this space kind of locked down, it gives us the kind of some freedom. It's like, there's an element of, like, in VR where it's like there's so many options and so much space to kind of deal with. And there's also the kind of attention of the audience where you're like, where are they looking? So it's like you start to have to think about things almost theatrically, like in real, like it's a performance. And then, of course, also there's just like a resolution thing. I mean, if Meta and some of these projects, 20 years, who knows what we'll be experiencing, because maybe we'll have something that's so inherently cinematic that everything I'm saying won't really matter anymore. But, ultimately, I think with the 4K image and using the sound as the kind of experiential immersive element along with it, you're activating the mind of the viewer in a way that I think in some ways is more cinematically powerful. That being said, so this room, this A stage, this is a theatrical Atmos room, and probably a lot of folks that are watching or listening to this are kind of aware of Atmos, maybe in the music context, which is kind of like, it's a 7-1, which is front speakers, center channel, side speakers, rear speakers, and 2 speakers on the ceiling, or sometimes 4. And those are, there's a renderer, there's software that kind of drives that, but in many ways it's still a little bit point source in a way. It's like you're still kind of hitting these speakers in the space with the sound, and you're basically creating buses in Pro Tools. Hopefully you've got some immersive reverbs or some up mixers that are kind of doing some psychoacoustic stuff, trying to give it a little bit of a kind of envelope of sound that you get immersed in, as opposed to just point sourcing the sound like you would in a 5.1 system or stereo. You're basically trying to take that kind of like phantom image quality that we're used to with a stereo sound and trying to kind of bring that into the full sphere of sound in the speakers. But, there are limitations, and there's phasing limitations, which has obviously been a huge issue in Atmos music mixing. There's, it's getting from a space of here's a lot of sources of sound into something that really kind of moves and immerses you in a way that mirrors your experience in the world is a little bit tricky. And I'm sure a lot of people who've kind of set up a 712 Atmos system have experienced that. It takes some work to try to get it to that place where it really feels like a kind of immersive experience. So, but, the home theater Atmos is really an outgrowth of the theatrical Atmos system. And the theatrical Atmos system is kind of, it is like the big, it's like the big kahuna of the Atmos setup. It's like it's like the home theater version of it is really kind of almost it's hard. I'm trying to think of the right word. It's like it's a kind of rendition of a little bit of the experience, but what's happening in the theatrical context is something that's actually more sophisticated in a way, and in sort of both in how the sound is created and then also how the sound is delivered. So on the creation side of it, for those folks who are in Logic or Pro Tools, and maybe you've set up, if you've worked in a 712 setup or some kind of ceiling speaker setup, you set up the buses and you're routing the sound to it. And then maybe if some people have gotten into like the home theater, if they bought like the production suite from Dolby, which gets you the Atmos renderer, which is doing some math to kind of help the pans. It's basically you're routing out to a separate app and it's doing some of the panning work along with the special object panners that are in Pro Tools. So you like switch the track to object, it sends information into the renderer, and then that ultimately affects the mix that goes to the speakers. So it's something similar that's happening for the theatrical Atmos, but in that case, the system, like this system is 28 surround speakers. So basically every 5 feet, there is a surround speaker all the way around the room. And then on the ceiling, every 5 feet across the ceiling in 2 rows. So we've got this whole dome of speakers around us that essentially if and we did some ray traces to kind of see, because this isn't the biggest room, where we could really ray trace based on the speaker spread and see like, basically, everything around this console and that far in each direction a little further is completely getting hit with every single one of these speakers right in its sweet spot. So you are truly getting a level of coverage that means that the sound can pan through all 6 speakers in a perfectly fluid way on the side, all the way around, and anywhere in between. So you never hear a jump. The overlap means that it's a perfect psychoacoustic dome of sound that you can generate. And so the way that that's done is, it's similar to what you would do with a home theater or music mix. We have bed tracks that are basically it's a 712 feed. It's a 10-channel feed that goes into the renderer. And then the renderer, based on that feed, it just disperses it out amongst the mixers. It's doing math to make it all sound good between the speakers. But then when it's object-based, it's actually doing in real time, it is doing the math to move the sound through the space. Now, the way that there's a little bit of a difference between maybe what someone's experienced with the music or home theater side, which is in that you're either using a standalone app in the same computer and you're feeding it with like a Dolby audio bridge is what it's called. It's basically like a virtual connection, like Soundflower or one of these, internal digital bus inside the computer, feeds the sound in, feeds it back to Pro Tools to monitor. In this big Atmos system, it's a lot more complex. We actually have to have a standalone computer, which you can do with home theater or music. You could use Dante or something like that. But with home theater, we actually have an RMU renderer, which is a dedicated PC server made by Dell that Dolby specs. It has RME MADI cards in it. So it has 128 in and 128 out MADI. That we use coax, so we can coax in a patch bay to get that. And then we have in Pro Tools, we have MADI Pro Tools interfaces. So we have two MADI Pro Tools interfaces connected to HDX cards in the system. It's a 3 HDX card system in this A stage. So then in Pro Tools, we have those 128 outputs over MADI. Those then are paired up with the objects or beds inside of Pro Tools. And then Pro Tools is communicating over our network with the RMU machine. So it feeds the panning metadata. So we can use the panners in Pro Tools as object panners or however we're doing it. Some of it's a little bit hybrid. We have multiple beds, not just a single bed, because we actually stem out our mix as beds. So the renderer actually has stems in the renderer. So it's stemmed out dialogue, music, and effects. And then we have, all the rest of it are objects. And so then when we're panning in Pro Tools or on the S6 console, we're both feeding out of the track over MADI into the RMU. It receives that on the MADI card, the RME MADI card, and then it lands in a renderer inside of that RMU that's doing all this math, which is a lot more complicated because it's doing all the math not for 12 speakers or 16 speakers. I think the max you can do in the music and home theater renderer is 16. It's doing it for 36 speakers. And that actually also includes some bass management because in the theatrical Atmos, we actually have surround subwoofers that are hanging on the corners of the room. So those are actually crossed over and have bass management for that sector of surround sounds on the ceiling and sidewalls. So not only do we have full range Dolby JBL speakers, we actually have a full 18-inch subwoofer for each sector of essentially 18 or each sector of 8 speakers that's doing bass management for them well. So we actually have a quadraphonic LFE or a bass management along with the 4 subwoofers that are behind the stage, which is the traditional LFE, and the 18-inch subwoofers that are on each of the front arrays, which they themselves each have an 18-inch or 2 18-inch subwoofers, one for left, center, and right. So that bass management's all done, in the crossovers for those speakers. So then what's happening is, because the renderer is just a dedicated, pretty high performance Dell computer, it is actually doing all this math. So just seamlessly, it can run, it can manage all the math for 128 inputs, panning or moving or doing whatever. And then it just spits those back out over MADI. And then in our case, we actually have a MADI to Dante converter. Our entire facility is Dante. So we actually do the MADI goes into a Dante converter. That hits Dante. And then actually from Dante, it goes to BSS, which is the tuning hardware system that JBL makes, or they own now. BSS used to be its own company. And so then we have dedicated DSP, and then that DSP itself is also in the amplifiers. So Crown amplifiers now you can buy a Crown amplifier with DSP built into the amplifier. So it'll do the speaker delays, it'll do the equalization, it'll do all the tuning that's needed. And then all of that then can land in these custom tablets, so we can actually make custom interfaces where we can make buttons to control. So like, for instance, I can make a button that makes it where it will do, if I wanted to do a 5-1 down mix, it'll reset the speakers so they become arrays. I can set levels in here. So for different, different loudness specs, things like that. And then we also can solo speakers and do things like that. So that's kind of the way the system works. And then, of course, the thing about the Dolby renderer is then all of that exists in what we do is we print into the renderer. So when we go to export the movie, we then basically it's synchronized over time code with Pro Tools. It's running a sync IO. So when we hit record in Pro Tools, the Dolby renderer RMU machine, the rendering mastering unit is what that stands for. It records the Atmos mix, but it records it not as speaker outputs, but it records it as objects and beds, but it's essentially recording the full multi-tracked set of audio with metadata from all the panners that are in a Pro Tools, and then that becomes a basically a package of sound and data for where that sound is panned within the speaker system. So now here's where it gets really cool. And this is actually the thing that probably most people don't know about Atmos Theatrical that's just absolutely bonkers sophisticated. So you've done your Atmos mix, you've rendered your Atmos mix into the renderer, you've got this package of files. That package of files, which is literally like wave files with metadata for all the moments in the movie, and it could be, a lot of it's bed channels, which are just basically like 712 stems. And then anything that's moving with the objects in the space that are certain pans. And I actually have also built out a kind of special reverb that's an object-based reverb where we can move parts of the reverb around in the space or move sections of it around in the objects. So all that information then, when they make the DCP, which is the digital cinema package, which would have the 4K video, and then this package, this Atmos mix package, that all goes onto a hard drive, and then that gets shipped to a theater. Let's say it goes to the Dolby Theater here in Burbank. At the Dolby Theater, they take the hard drive, they plug that into their media block, which is Dolby actually also owns they're not the only ones that make it, but they make a lot of the media servers that run the actual DCPs when they play back in a theater. I guarantee the Dolby Theater has a Dolby Dolby media block server. So then when that hard drive gets plugged in, what happens is that the server communicates with the Dolby unit that's in the actual theater, which is what contains the tuning for the speakers. It has all the information about how many speakers are in that particular theater. It could be up to 64 speakers. It has the information. It literally has a plot. And we did the same thing when we built this room. There's a plot that is where every speaker is located and its height and all of its, location. And then that DCP, when it plays back, it takes all that metadata and those objects and it scales it up for that particular room. So my room has 36 speakers. So when it plays back in the Dolby Theater, it's going to scale up my pans and my metadata so that what I played that's spaced out in this room, and so I say like, oh, this sound pans here and then lands in the back, it will scale up that mix based on the metadata and the objects so that the pan will be exactly the same experience in a theater that's twice as many speakers and much larger. So it's essentially, it's a real-time mixer that's taking the information that I've created in my mix and then tailoring it to the specific space, whether it's a small theater that has half as many speakers as my room or a big theater that has twice as many. And so in that way, it's almost functioning like a video game middleware, like where it's, it's responsive to the environment and it's kind of dynamic in its own way. And that's really, really sophisticated stuff, So you're going to then be able to get we could, and of course, in like a sci-fi movie or something where there's like big pans and things, that's one thing. But then, with the movie we're doing right now, which is this historical epic, it's as much about this kind of immersive experiential quality to the movie where it's like we're going on ships and we're in these big crowd scenes and we're in Five Points, New York in 1900s, and we're kind of moving through the alleyways and moving through the streets and people are walking past. And so in that way, it's like, it's not like airplanes flying by or sort of the traditional things we think about with big Atmos mixes. But what we're going to be able to do is we're going to then be able to create something that's sort of really experiential and immersive. And that still is going to be able to translate, which is something that's been difficult. It's something that you often lose whenever you're in a traditional 5-1 mix, when you're moving from theater to theater, because it's just not tuned as precisely. There's more variation. And ultimately, the surround speakers in a 5-1 system are band limited. They don't really reproduce a lot of detail. So those kinds of pans, you might get a little bit of a feeling of a pan happening like that, but you're not going to get a kind of detail that would mirror the way you would kind of experience something in a first person way. So, so that's also really exciting. And then, the final part is that these mixes, the renderer can render them back down. So we can render out a 7-1. We can render out a 7-1-2 like home theater Atmos. We can render out a stereo version. We can even render out a binaural version, right? So theoretically, and if you've ever watched some Netflix with your like Apple earbuds, like the newest earbuds here that have the Atmos capability, if you've ever tried that, like watching like Narcos on Netflix or something, you really get this immersive, interesting experience. And that's because it's taking that Atmos metadata and it's bringing that into even this binaural stereo version of the movie. So that's also really exciting. And I think, the vision for a company like mine, especially where, we do a variety of movies. We're doing some bigger movies that are going to have a big wide release theatrical. We also do a lot of movies that are, streaming movies, festival movies. And, I think up to now, there's been a big dividing line between, okay, well, big things and big TV shows, you can do Atmos on that. But, all these other movies, 5-1's good. It doesn't really matter. Most people are just going to watch stereo. So we'll just do a down mix on that. I think one of the things that we're really excited about exploring is because now we have the full footprint of what an Atmos mix can be and how it can be experienced, we're going to be able to like work in here in a theatrical version of the movie, even if it's not a big enough movie that they're going to be making these DCPs that have Atmos mixes on them. But we're going to be able to use the renderer. We're going to be able to use the software, and we're going to be able to capture some of the kind of psychoacoustic experience of even what's in the Atmos version in the 5-1 version. So instead of just doing a 5-1, we'll be able to actually mix in 5-1 using the Atmos tools and then make a rendered version that hopefully in the 5-1 we're capturing a little bit more detail and spatiality. And then especially, it's quite possible that that binaural version, that headphones version, might really be able to capture something experientially that's very close to what you might experience in a theatrical setting. So that's something we're really thinking about for the future. And, it's something even in how we built our rooms here and how we have different size stages with different configurations of speakers. We're ultimately going to get an ARC soundbar here so we can have a room. One of the other small studios we're going to set up with the ARC soundbar so we can actually be like, okay, let's hear what the ARC soundbar is doing in the mix. And even like working with a binaural version, like we've got, here we've got these great, Say that
again.
Oh,
sorry. I'm trouble hearing
uh-oh. Alexa thought I was talking to her. We've even been experimenting with, working with some of these open back headphones. These are these 800S Sennheisers, which are great. I mean, they sound fantastic, and they have a great HD 800Ss. They have a great soundstage, but they're also kind of not so fatiguing that we can actually mix in them, for long periods of time. So even in this, we've done some work with like, okay, let's really play with what the binaural Atmos render can sound like of a movie and actually spend a little time with it, not just spit out the output, but actually get to feel for like, how is this working? How does this capture the experience we're experiencing in the big stage? And, ultimately, I'd love to be in a position where we don't have to be biased towards the theatrical version of the movie. We can actually really try to capture and create and render and produce a version of the mix in each context that's very specifically tailored for that, and hopefully in a way that it doesn't have to be a big undertaking, to do each one. That actually because the Dolby tool is already kind of set up to do this. And of course, there's always tweaks and adjustments. And, there's always things you're like, oh, when that crashes down to stereo, it sounds funny. There's always going to be that. There's always going to be a need for a near field mix. But the hope is like, oh, we can spend a very small amount of time, essentially do a QC of each of the versions of the mix, maybe make a couple tweaks, and end up with something that everybody from like the Dolby Theater all the way down to like earbuds on an iPhone are experiencing something that's really immersive and experiential.
That's pretty cool, because I was thinking about that for you, because even if I'm working in stereo here, I have to go out and listen to it in the car and on a different set of headphones.
Right.
You have to do that because there's just, your room is one thing, your speakers, your monitors, everything's a factor. So you got to get a taste.
Yeah.
When you're talking 36 speakers, it just, I was so excited in some of the last work I was doing. I made it a point to mix everything in mono first, and then I hit the mono button and everything goes stereo. I'm like, wow, I got all this extra room. I'm just picturing you guys now with that.
Yeah. Well, there's times where I'll have on the top, I'll set this like really cheap, like I bought at Costco, like the cheapest stereo soundbar I could get at Costco, sit it across we're kind of doing final mix downs or final QCs. I'll set that across the top of the console here, and in BSS, we can just flip right between the big mix and the soundbar and just go back and forth, and it's interesting. I mean, for the most part, it's like, it's like there's always scenes, where it's like the dynamics range is an issue. That's the biggest thing. I mean, I think the tools for Atmos and in general, I mean, there's just so many incredible plugins. One of the companies we've worked directly with and, that we really love is Penteo, that makes the Penteo Upmix plugin. Incredible. And, it's like, it's one of these things. It's just a little bit magic, like, I don't know why that Penteo Upmixer, when I take that stereo music and run it through the Penteo Upmixer, for whatever reason, it really does something special to it, and it really unwraps it. And that's a little bit of, that's a designer, that's someone that's really an artist. Thinking about how you take the mathematics of upmixing something and make it sound actually really interesting and musical and beautiful. And it's the same with, we use the Experiential audio reverbs, which are, Michael Carnes, who is one of the Lexicon reverb folks, I believe. He's an artist, and so he's now making, we've got a 716 Atmos reverb, but that's coming from his mind. That's all programmed. It's not a convolution, and it's beautiful. So that's, that stuff is really powerful. And that translates. If I listen to the binaural version of that Atmos mix, it isn't like it just all collapses down and disappears. That's all still captured in there. That math, that's, even when it comes back down, it's kind of like opening it up and getting it out, up-resing it in a way. A lot of that sticks with it. And I've even had on a couple of Atmos movies I did, where we had to do some recuts, and the editors were actually using our stereo version of our dubs to do the recut. And they were like, we're just listening here on computer speakers, and it's like it's sounding so like a 5.1 movie. It's like it's really feels immersive, and it's because the information that's being generated by this software that, as a practical purpose in the Atmos mix, it's doing something very interesting and very special that's retained as you go back down to the fewer channel versions. So, so ultimately for us, a lot of times it's not about capturing those details. It's about dynamic range, because the dynamic range in the theater here, the balance between music and dialogue, when we go down to a sound bar, or we go to a pair of stereo speakers, especially like earbuds or a laptop, the dynamic range that they can't reproduce the detail from loud to soft. And so, you get that classic thing where you're like turning the music down, and then, I can't hear the dialogue, turning the dialogue up. Right. So a lot of times what we're doing when we take a mix back down from Atmos to home theater and then to stereo is that's what we're dealing with, is like the dynamic range. Or, we lose when we do a stereo down mix, we often lose, the standard for LTRT, the Dolby LTRT, the Pro Logic down mix is you just eliminate the LFE channel, right? So a lot of times we have information in that LFE channel that we just lost. And so suddenly the moment doesn't feel very impactful. We did this movie, The Voyeurs, and it's for Amazon, and there's a big scene in the middle of that movie that's, a big party scene, and there's like pounding bass. And when we went to the stereo and the home theater version, we lost some of that because the dynamic range just wasn't there. So you couldn't get that real sense of like, the loud, soft thing. And so then we had to go in, and also we were just hitting, it was just feeling a little crunched. So we had to kind of, how do we open this up? How do we kind of find a way through this? And, that's a lot of it, really. And that's similar to music mixing, right? You're going to your overtones, you're going to the car, because, those speakers, you got to hear how they're degrading it. So.
Yeah, you got to get a sense of how it gets translated at different volumes. Different
Right.
And yes, a lot of times I think there's a little balancing act where you kind of, maybe if I just take a little out here where it sounds great, it'll fit a little better everywhere else.
Right. Oh yeah. And that's the name of the game with movie mixing, because, we're working. I mean, like I've got a mix open here. I don't know how many tracks we've got going right now. Let's see if it pops up here. This template right now, it's 400 voices. So that's several hundred tracks. So that, that the amount of layers you're dealing with, and also you're dealing with like different people making different things. It's like there's an entire score and music coming in that I've heard maybe temp dubs or I've heard versions of, but like in this movie, that's a orchestral score recorded with like a 80-piece orchestra in Rome that's going to be coming in. And then I've got, all this dialogue. We've been working on that dialogue track now for many months, and ADR and all these things. And then now we're kind of in the design phase, and Foley's coming in. That's all new stuff. And so now we're going to get into some moments where we've got a scene. There's 100 extras. It's completely immersive. Things are happening. People are passing by. We've got score going, a big orchestral score going. We've got lines of dialogue that we have to hear within that. And it's also just got to be enjoyable and not so loud that it like makes people want to crawl behind their couch, or behind their theater seat. So, it's like this kind of thing about the layers and always a balancing act and always trade-offs is a really interesting part of the process of working in a movie. Though we do have more speakers. And so a lot of it is also about thinking spatially. It's like, pulling the music. One of the things that they're doing, and that's a common technique, and it'll be interesting on this movie if we go do this, is with the music score, they'll pull, since the surrounds are full range, they'll kind of pull the music off the screen a little bit. So you're just creating a little bit of separation from the left, right, and center of the picture and the music. And so, our ears are very spatially aware. So we, and our ability to hear intelligibility is spatial. So actually just doing that, suddenly you're able to kind of hear more of the sound design work on the screen with picture, and then still perceive the detail of the music in a way that if the music and the sound were both coming from the left, right speakers, your brain can't sort out those frequencies. So that's
pulling the music back from the front speakers.
Yeah,
then?
yeah,
Oh, wow.
just slightly. So you're just pulling the image off the screen just
making
a
a
little
little
bit.
room.
Yeah, exactly. So you're just like, you're activating that part of our perception where we can really, it's like, if this is a 5-10 degrees different, I could really perceive those two sounds separately in a way that together the masking effect kicks in, and we're losing frequencies. Right. So yeah, those are some of the techniques that are employed, and we're going to be doing a lot of that in this movie, just because we've got all these extras. We've got loop group, which is where we go and record extra actors talking for all the background actors. So we've got all this material, and really thinking about how we space it out, how we create frequency space within the mix, so that everything can kind of have its place. It's essential to be able to kind of let all of this live together.
Yeah. Well, this is a similar thing that came up in discussing Atmos with the people that are doing it with music. And I had a good episode with Matt Wallace and Will Kennedy that I'll put in the show notes.
Yeah, I heard it. It's fantastic.
But it's what's coming up, and I'm sensing this with you too, is that we have to start thinking of new techniques, new strategies. So like the old playbook of like what you're supposed to do.
Right.
Like, that's a really interesting idea that you have now you have this, like, I can separate the sound a few degrees like we would in real life, where if somebody just walked a few steps over, now they're separate from whatever's happening on the side.
Yeah, those guys were talking about that, right? With doing like the Love Shack mix, and how you have to you first got to start with this kind of left, center, right field. And then once you kind of get things spread out, you can kind of hear what you've got, and you can start to kind of build out the rest of the world from there. Yeah, it's similar to what we're doing. I mean, I'm also, Atmos is, and I don't consider myself an expert on Atmos mixing. I mean, I'm kind of, I've done a few projects. I've done some VR work. We're kind of really leaning into this in terms of our workflow to kind of engage it a lot more. And that is a big part of it, is just not only thinking about, how do we just use more speakers to do the same thing that we've always done, which I actually is one of my biggest criticisms of the use of Dolby Atmos, is that, and early on, especially, now it's gotten better, but, a lot of times there was a real feeling, it was like, oh, this is basically just a 5-1 mix, and then they like threw something on the ceiling a couple times, and, it was like, it wasn't really thinking about it in this kind of holistic way, and in this experiential way, and now that's obviously, there are incredible exceptions, and I think over time, in the movie side, as people have had more experience with it, they're able to use it more. But I actually think there's a lot of potential to just really start to think about, because in a way, I think it's often just thought about as a panner. Right? It's like, oh, this is a high resolution panner. So something we would pan around and the surrounds will pan, and we'll have better resolution for that. What I'm more excited about is thinking about point of view, thinking about in this kind of more perceptual, experiential way for the audience, where, one of the big things I've been doing is we're building out for this movie, because again, it's not an action movie per se. It's like, there's some moments where there's some kind of, it's a little bit of a thriller at some moments, but really it's like a historical epic. But it's shot in this very immersive way, and the way the camera moves is kind of the camera's always moving through the world, and a lot of times the camera is like, becoming a surrogate for the main character as she's moving through the world and experiencing the world, and so I'm really thinking about how can we use Atmos in a way to kind of make the world this enveloping, sometimes a little foreboding, place, and so using that resolution to really kind of think environmentally a lot of times, right? And maybe it's like, and certainly panning things when we're walking through certain areas, or that'll definitely be a part of it. But I think we're thinking more for the overall movie is like, how are we always kind of in the movie, and how can we use Atmos to always bring the audience into the experience of the main character and into the world of the movie. And I think there's a lot of territory for that. I think there's a lot of potential for that that is unexplored, honestly. And so, because I think, and I mean, that's always the way, right? It's like, it's always like the early, the early surround sound movies, though surround sound was around a lot earlier than you think. Fantasia was mixed in surround sound prior to World War II. They actually invented the pan knob when they were making Fantasia to be able to do the panning that they wanted to do. But and we think of like Apocalypse Now, one of the iconic, Atmos mixes, or 5.1 mixes, right? Which was Dolby Stereo at the time. So and Star Wars, right? And THX, and there was even, it's sometimes talked about how Star Wars really pushed things forward for sound because it was so popular that the audience in a lot of theaters, their sound setups were really terrible, and they didn't even have surround speakers for Dolby Stereo, or sometimes it's like, oh, the left and right didn't even work. It was actually just mono, and they just didn't even bother to fix it. And because Star Wars was so popular, you've got these ships passing over, and they had really thought about the mix. The audience was like, I want to hear those ships. I want to hear all of this. And so they demanded, better speakers. And that's where THX certification came from, which was essentially kind of to goad the presenters along to have a certification for a room that was really set up correctly to play back Dolby Stereo. So there's always been the kind of like the vanguard of these things was always like the science fiction, the war movies, the things that were really going to drive kind of, what was of the time a very immersive experience. And I think that's the same. And I think now maybe we're going to be settling into thinking about it in a little bit of a broader way, that it's not something that's just reserved for, for spaceships and helicopters. Mm-hmm. So.
Yeah, it's a storytelling tool, I guess, in the end, right?
Yeah.
And there's all kinds of ways it can be used. And like you said, just because you're not just flying around in a spaceship, you're still immersed in the story and the film. And the end goal is to really showcase that and pull out those emotional reactions to the story.
Yeah. So we're really excited about it. I mean, it's something I've been thinking about for my whole career, that I've always been working towards something that, it wasn't about action movies and big blockbusters and big tentpole stuff. It's about something that's more experiential. It's about something that's maybe a little more intimate, about something that's about like the details and the subtleties. And so that's what I'm excited about with this tool. And it's like, then when you start to think about it as like, oh, this is about resolution, right? It's not about panning, it's about resolution. And so we've got all this spatial resolution, and there's so many ways to think about using that. So
it's incredible. It's exciting for us as moviegoers too,
Yeah.
And I got to tell you, I went to a presentation by Avid years ago in New York City. They were doing something with film. I don't remember exactly what they were kind of promoting, But I think I was telling you this before. They had just like it was like a Paul Rudd romantic comedy film that was coming out that they were showing us, and they were
Yeah.
demonstrating like everything that's going on. And the session had something like 300 tracks
Yeah.
for
Yeah.
this one scene, and it wasn't spaceships and fast cars and
Right.
monsters and
Right.
dragons flying,
Yeah. Yeah.
and it just gave me such a sense of how much goes into every little detail. It was like the footsteps of the people walking by them in the
Yeah.
park and the
Yeah.
little birds going by. All
Yeah.
of
Yeah.
these incredible little details that are put together to make this magically immersive feeling.
Yeah. Yeah. It's incredible. And I also think it's we're in a renaissance in so many ways for this work. And I actually think I have a feeling. I think we're about to kind of take another leap forward, and maybe not all at once, but I don't know if you saw this movie, Making Waves. It's a documentary that some of the faculty at USC produced over many years, and it's a documentary about sound in movies. And it would be a great thing for your audience if you're interested in kind of learning a little more about the kind of details of sound in movies. It's a really cool documentary. It premiered at Tribeca a couple years ago, and I was lucky enough to get to be at the premiere. And it's a little rah USC, which is USC is like
Fair.
the crowd jewel, and where and Walter Murch and Ben Burt and Gary Rydstrom came from there, and they're the kind of main protagonists of the documentary. And by all means, they're some of the greatest practitioners of this work that have ever existed. And it's a cool movie. It's a great overview for sound in movies, and lots of nice interviews. But also, Ben said they did a talk back afterwards with Walter and Ben, and Gary were all there, which is really cool. And Ben Burt, such an inspiration to all of us who do this work, who's the sound designer of Star Wars, and behind the sound of the lightsaber, and also he did Wally. He's literally voiced the character Wally.
That was a good
Just
one too.
such an incredible artist, and also just such a magnanimous and generous human being. And for in promoting our work and thinking about our work. He said something that I thought was very much in that mind of a real generous artist, and said, he's like, I saw it. I'm paraphrasing. I don't remember exactly the way he said this, but essentially he said, it was great seeing all this work they had done, and in the documentary. But he said, I do feel like maybe we've kind of in a place where things have been the same, and I think that maybe we're about to like move on to something even more, that the idea of what sound in a movie is very much kind of this trajectory from New American Cinema and Lucas and Coppola and these great movies, but they have a certain kind of feeling, and there's a way of making work, and there's a way of organizing the work and the way of mixing the work that's all been kind of similar. And I do think that we are maybe we're maybe moving into an interesting new phase with all of this. And I think there's visual things. If you look at this room, this console I've got here is 16 faders, right? And these 16 faders on this console, because that touchscreen in the middle has every VCA, and this console spills VCAs, I've got 400 tracks in here, or 300. I can hit one button and have any of the 8 tracks in the mix on my left hand at any time. And on my right hand, I have a VCA. Between 5 faders, I can control every sound in the movie. And so it's a really different way to think about it relative to if I go over to Warner and there's a console there with 200-300 channels on it, right? And that's actually a vestige of analog production when you were on tape machines and there wasn't any other way to do it. Like maybe at some point in the 60s and 70s, they got automation, which was essentially MIDI running stepper motors. But, it was really about, you need a bunch of people in this room together to be able to mix it, because it goes back to the tape in real time, and it's a very real time thing. Whereas now we're in this automation space, it's actually a big console like that is actually not useful, because I got to move my body up and down to even get to tracks. Whereas here, I literally don't even have to move, and I can just be moving through. I can see, this touchscreen has meter for every VCA. I can tell which set my certain effect is in. I hit that button, and there it is in my left hand. It's so much faster, and so but it doesn't. Does this feel as cool as 200 channels sitting here? No, it's visually, it's not. It doesn't seem as professional, but in fact, I can work much more efficiently with this footprint. And, I specially design, the beauty of the S6 is it's modular. I built this specifically so I could put the monitor in the middle, because you can kind of set it up how you want. And, I could get both this module and this module close enough to me that I'm not leaning forward. And it's so efficient, And even when you're working in Pro Tools, the way the S6 is set up, you can I can touch any VCA. I'm working through a scene. If I touch the VCA, it just throws the tracks into the left hand. So it's like, even when I'm editing, I'm automatically in this kind of symbiotic relationship with the console in front of me. So even that is like mixing and editing. It's all kind of a very fluid process. So, so that's one example of like, yeah, we have a lot of tracks, but we also, we have the way the systems are set up now, it's not such a huge team, or it doesn't necessarily have to be anymore. It can be, you can really have a much more of a tactile and direct relationship with all that material, even though it's technically a lot of tracks, but because I can access all of it so quickly and I can control all of it so quickly and organize it in this like very thoughtful, very modular way. It's a very different thing than even maybe what you saw in that big mix a few years ago, So that's just one example. Another example I could give you is like the independent sound effects recording world is just incredible. Like if you go on a sound effect, there are like hundreds of incredible sound recordists like recording these amazing libraries, or the library Hiss and a Roar, which is a artist in New Zealand, and he's like, I'm gonna make a library that's all just banging on metal. I'm gonna make a library that's all just like bubbling water, or footsteps on the ocean, like these really detailed, really well recorded libraries. Whereas like even when I first started, it was like there was sound dogs, there was sound ideas, there were like some of these like basically companies that bought the libraries from the big studios, and that was kind of it, And now we've got, there's so much incredible stuff. And then actually there's the whole movement of kind of crowdsourced sound effects editing or sound effects recording, which has been happening, which is also a really cool thing. I don't know if you're familiar with any of that, but
crowdsourced, no.
Yeah, there's like and I to be honest, haven't participated a lot in it, but there's like projects where they'll put up a crowdsourced sound recording project where they'll be like, it's just record sounds in your house. And so people will just go and record the sound effects and then organize all of them, and then they'll just compile them into one big library, and everybody who contributed gets the library. So stuff like that's really cool. So exciting. And also, like things like, this whole thing that I've done here, it's very unique, but I don't think it's going to be unique. It's like, I think I'm at the forefront of a real transition in how we think about the work and how we do it. The internet, forums, all the different technologies that we have access to, everything's becoming a lot more accessible. And so, for me, I'm like almost every part of this, I've had at least some hand in it, from designing the footprint of the facility to building the acoustic treatments or designing our ceiling clouds, which are unique to what, how we approach that. And even like programming my BSS system, which is how we control all of the speaker systems in the facility. Whereas like, I learned how to go in and program that stuff so I can have my own custom interfaces that control the speaker system, and I can do it in a way that I know it will facilitate the way I work. And that's really unique. Even just the idea of people understanding how to build a studio. There's so much more information and so many more resources to kind of understand how to do that. So that's, all these things are changing. And even like, and I think your audience, the music audience, we, on one hand, our entire signal chain is incredibly digital, and that's really great in a lot of ways. Like just the amount of copper wire I would have had to have put in this place to have how many surround systems and how many, it would be crazy in the analog days. And now everything's on a Cat 5, Cat 6 cables. We've got a dedicated Dante network. We've got everything's just, it's a couple 1,000-foot rolls of Cat 6, and we can get anything anywhere in the building we need. So that's cool. And then at the same time, we've got this revolution in outboard gear, right? We've got 500 series, and we can now, it's like we can have a whole bunch of different stuff that used to be like, oh, every one of those is a $5,000 box that we have to buy. And for a company like mine, where we don't, we're not tracking bands, we're not doing big record sessions, it wouldn't even make sense for us to own some of that gear. But we can be very thoughtful and say like, okay, we're going to really develop some very specific signal chains for what we're going to be doing. So for instance, like, we have a voiceover signal chain that's like a Great River Neve clone going into a Buzz Audio optical compressor, and then into a Harrison EQ, right? It's this nice, warm, really sounds great. Then recently we set up a new ADR chain, which is the new SSL6, the two amazing SSL preamps with the compressors and the bus compressor, all with beautiful faders, all in a footprint that's this big, right? That goes into a MyTech converter. We have an 8x192 MyTech converter, and then literally right below that we have a digital to Dante, AES to Dante box, and then right from there it hits the Dante system, and then it's available everywhere. Right? Like it's so cool because it's like, it's the best of both worlds. It's like awesome analog stuff, and then really easy, super patchable, available everywhere digital, and it's everything like that. MyTech sounds incredible. And right. And so now everything's digital from then on. So we captured it pristine. Now it just lives in the box from that point on. Right. Or our Foley stage, we built out a new system there. We're using this incredible preamp made by what's the company called? Pueblo Audio, which if you're not in the movie business and sound, you may not have ever heard of. Pueblo Audio are these beautiful handmade preamps. It's a rack preamp. It has a giant separate power supply that has to be set away from the preamp because it puts off so much electromagnetic interference because it literally weighs like 25 pounds. And they are just the most detailed, pristine, high-gain preamps that are just specifically designed for recording Foley, right? Which you need like, oh, I'm literally recording like my hands touching like this, or just like a shirt moving a little bit. So you really have to have, a regular preamp, you're just going to have too much self-noise, right? Mm-hmm. And so in that case, we're going from there. We're going into a Trident. The company Trident came out with this awesome 500 series high-low tracking filter, which is just like, it's just what it sounds like. It's a high pass and a low pass. And then it has a cool feature where you can do it'll bump it so you can tune in the pass filter. But it's like, which again for Foley, it's like we're not EQing the Foley a lot. We just need to make sure we don't get any rumble and we don't get any hiss. And then from there, it goes into a really nice compressor, which is that, that's like the really nice compressor is that little boutique compressor. It's like the most transparent compressor. It's like an analog compressor with digital circuits controlling it. So it's staged. So you just literally never hear it pump. And then all that goes into an Antelope Audio Pure 2 converter. So it's like, it is a beautiful, pristine, very, very bespoke setup for our Foley. And that's, again, it's like, that's all you need. It's a great thing about post-production. It's like, we're not tracking bands. Technically we could put together, we've got 6 good preamps we could put together. The MyTech will do eight analog to digital. Like, we could do some music if we need to, but for the most part, we're doing this very focused work and we need very specific things to do it. So, and it's great because it's like 500 series and, things like the SSL6, it's so perfect for what we're doing. And then, it's so easy, then it's on the network and, it's in the box. So,
yeah, it's amazing. And like you said, the times we're in it are just loaded with opportunity.
Yeah. And I think that we're, creatively too. Because I think that kind of coming full circle to what we were talking about at the beginning, we're having some growing pains. How do we articulate what we do? How do we understand these processes that we're creating, which are like, where it's like you're doing multiple jobs and multiple roles, and it's all what used to be an army of people in the case of sound work in movies is now like it's a really small, tight-knit team that can produce all this. So I think creatively that's also really exciting because it's like everybody's getting closer to the end result, and with a smaller team, everything's like a game of telephone, It's like if I have 25 guys and I'm trying to kind of do something that has an overarching creative vision, that's tough. But if it's 5 or 6 guys working together or women, and that's another thing, right? We're also trying to get different voices in the conversation. And that's a big focus of what we're trying to do, which is that we don't want a team that's always just the traditional sound guys, So that's also something we're thinking about, is like thinking about the team as a whole and different people with different backgrounds and different experiences. So, so even in that, it's a factor in kind of where we're headed, I think, which is pretty exciting. So
it is. I'm really happy for you that you've got this all going, and your excitement is obvious. You're really enjoying this, and I think
I am.
I'm excited to go try to remember to listen to some of the sound on some of these things you mentioned.
Yeah.
And
if you want to check out a movie that I did recently, is this movie The Voyeurs. If you haven't seen it, it's on Amazon. It stars Sydney Sweeney from Euphoria. It's like a erotic thriller. It's kind of a throwback to the erotic thrillers of the 90s. It's really a cool movie, and the sound design of the movie is integrated into the narrative of the movie. It is a part of the narrative of the movie. It's sort of Rear Window or The Conversation, if you know those classic movies. It very much is in the world of Rear Window and The Conversation. It's about surveillance and it's and then there's actually a little bit of if you know the movie The Conversation. If you don't know the movie The Conversation, you should know the movie The Conversation. One of the greatest sound movies of all time. Walter Murch designed it. Francis Ford Coppola directed it. Gene Hackman plays a surveillance man who's bugging people. It's so good. But in The Voyeurs, there's a section which is a little bit of an homage to we tried to bring in a little bit of even the sound and the quality of the sound of The Conversation. So, but it's a cool movie. It's a lot of fun. So I think if you want to check out, that's a definitely one that should be available if you have Amazon Prime. You can, it's up there. So
yeah, I'll put that in the show notes, and maybe that'll be my viewing material tonight or this weekend.
Nice. And please come to the website. There's lots of links to movies we've done. You can check out the virtual tour of the studio. And if any of you all are in Burbank and you want to come by for a tour, we're always open to visits. And if you're a filmmaker or a composer that works in film, we'd love to talk with you and about collaborating. Or if you're another mixer and you're looking for a place to maybe mix a movie, we also do that. So we do four-walling some too, where people come in and rent out the stages for a week or two. So So
excellent. That's TISD.TV, right?
That's it. Yeah,
okay,
that's the site. And there's also on there's a couple articles I've written kind of, in the vein of some of what we've talked about, but I wrote an article for Post Magazine a few months back, kind of talking about a little more about building my facility and, what it's like to start a Post business. And then also I wrote the article I mentioned for Movie Maker about, it's called The Invisible Art, How Sound Design is Finally Getting Its Due, which talks a little bit about the history of sound design and a little bit about some of these things about where we're headed with this work and how we think and talk about this work. So,
Excellent. I'll put as much of that as I can in the show notes. But it's been great talking to you. I really appreciate you going into all that detail. A lot of stuff I'm very unfamiliar with, so it's good to learn quite a lot from you today.
Oh, thanks. Yeah. Sometimes I like to dig into the technical side. So I kind of, I once in a while, it's I've done a few podcasts, but sometimes it's not appropriate to kind of dig real deep on, like object-based mixing or some of these things. But I thought your audience would probably be into it. So
yeah, it's cool. And, stark contrast to how I spent my night last night with my cassette 4-track recorder.
I know.
Really appreciating how simple it was to just plug in and hit record. And it's just
totally
an opposite extreme by far.
I'll leave you with this little story. I started out, we all start out in music, and I was a music guy and a singer and in choir and in rock bands growing up in kind of rural Illinois. I grew up kind of out in the middle of nowhere, Illinois. And I would never have kind of gotten onto any of this except that my best friend Nick, who was an only child, his parents, he was a guitar player and he had really hip parents, and and we were in a band together, and his parents bought him the first Roland digital Portastudio, which was essentially like a digital 4-track. I think it had 4 inputs and 8 faders and then 4 record tracks. So you could do a little bit of mixing and things like that. That was like in high school, and I had never done any recording really or anything with technology and music and sound. And, we started tracking stuff with that. We started recording other sounds with it. And I think I got the bug right there, But it's funny because even that was digital. I feel like I was like right at literally, if it had been a year before, I would have had a analog 4-track, but it was like right there. And it was one of the first kind of devices like that. So I feel like I've always been a little bit in the box, but yeah, I mean, it is good to get back to a little bit of tape. And if you guys go to the website, you'll see the logo for This Is Sound Design is the cassette tape.
Oh, that's cool. Yeah, I felt like I was 16 again when I was playing with this thing last night. I was just the immediacy of it and the kind of just, you're done, you record it and that's what you got. But it also creates that appreciation of what you can do now. Like, I couldn't edit anything I did on this thing, so I could easily fix the mistakes in the computer and have something really nice. Hey, that's the beauty, right? Like you kind of alluded to it before. You've got the best of the analog and the digital, and we can always go back if we want, and we can always charge forward in the future, as you seem to be doing.
Yeah, that's the plan. So, I feel so thrilled to be where I am, and I think we're on the precipice as an industry and as creators. I think we're on the precipice of a whole new wave of really interesting and cool stuff. So I'm excited for everybody, and hopefully, some of you that are listening out there, we can collaborate in some way. So, it's all about community. That's another thing. One of the great things in especially coming out of this time of COVID, and also just in general, we spend so much time in our screens and we spend so much time on the computers. I think one of the things I love about movie making is that we get into a room together and we listen together, and there's that element of it. And, and the extension of that is we're really trying to have a community here for filmmakers and sound designers and creators, composers. So, one of the things we're going to be doing in the coming year, we haven't done our official grand opening, even though we've been open for about a year, but unfortunately with COVID, it's tough. Cause I feel like every time we start to plan the big party, it's like we hear oh, maybe we need to wait a little longer. So we're hoping in the fall, we're going to actually try to do some big events. We're going to try to have some cool, have some filmmakers come in, do some Q&As. We're going to try maybe have some music events, have some bands come in and play. So we're also going to try to, build a community, try to make this also just about togetherness and about creating together. So
really cool.
Keep an eye out for that. We'll be posting on the website down the line when things. And I think at some point we're going to get a newsletter or something. We've been talking about that. But the other thing is we have all the social media. So, we have an Instagram and we have Facebook. So, also just add us on Instagram and we'll be posting about events and things on there. That's probably about the best place to find out what's going on and find out about movies we have coming up. And there's a bunch coming out in the future. So, so reach out to us.
Excellent. And thank you for listening. I hope you've enjoyed the show. Really cool stuff. Check out tisd.tv, and I think that's going to connect you everywhere, and we'll have plenty in the show notes too.
All right. Thanks, man. It was really a pleasure to talk with you.
Yeah, great having you.
All right. Bye for now.
Hey, if you enjoyed the Music Production Podcast, please consider giving it a review on your favorite podcast provider and share it with a friend, somebody that you think might enjoy the show and get something out of it. That would mean a lot to me. And if you want to check out more of my work, including sound packs, tutorials, etc., head over to brianfunk.com. Thanks so much for listening and have a great day.